Have you ever heard of a company, not a country, not a king, but a company, ruling over millions of people, collecting taxes, waging wars, and reshaping the destiny of a continent? It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, but this isn't fiction, this was real. And it was called the East India Company. The year was 1600. Queen Elizabeth I, ever eager to expand England's influence and fill her treasury, signed a royal charter granting a group of wealthy merchants the right to trade in the East Indies. It was a license to get rich, a golden ticket, but it would become something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. The men behind this venture were not soldiers or governors. They were businessmen, calculating, ambitious, and willing to do whatever it took to turn profit into power. Their company began with a modest aim: to buy spices, silks, and exotic goods from Asia and sell them back home. But they found a gold mine, not in the East Indies as intended, but in India, a land of empires, riches, and an ancient civilization far older than Britain itself. India at the time was a patchwork of kingdoms, some powerful, some fractured, and the East India Company saw opportunity in that disunity. They started small. Trading posts or factories were established in coastal cities like Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. These weren't just warehouses, they were footholds. British merchants exchanged cloth and silver for Indian cotton, spices, and tea. But even in these early days, trade wasn't always peaceful. There were skirmishes with rival European powers, especially the Portuguese, Dutch, and French, which turned commercial competition into military confrontation. And then, the company made its first dangerous pivot. Realizing trade was vulnerable without protection, they hired soldiers, Sepoys, Indian men trained in European warfare, and built private armies. By the early 18th century, the East India Company's armed forces had swelled to over 260,000 troops. That was twice the size of the British Army at times. A corporation now had more firepower than many nations. And it was just getting started. In 1757, a pivotal moment arrived that would change Indian history forever: the Battle of Plassey in Bengal. Robert Clive, an ambitious, ruthless officer of the East India Company, marched with a relatively small force against the Nawab or Prince of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The Nawab had dared to resist British encroachment and had seized the British fort at Calcutta. But Clive had a secret weapon: bribery. He convinced Mir Jafar, a key general in the Nawab's army, to switch sides mid-battle. The result? A stunning British victory, and with it, control over Bengal, the richest province in India. Suddenly, the East India Company wasn't just trading, it was ruling. From that base, they began spreading their influence, quiet at first, but unstoppable. Clive returned to Britain a hero, and a very rich man, but even heroes face judgment. When he was called to account before Parliament for corruption and exploitation, Clive arrogantly declared, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." But his so-called moderation oversaw some of the darkest chapters in India's colonial history. In 1770, Bengal was ravaged by famine. Failed harvests were part of the cause, but the East India Company's relentless taxation and export of food for profit turned disaster into catastrophe. Over 10 million people died, villages emptied, corpses lined the roads, and all the while, company profits soared. The British Parliament, increasingly uneasy about this corporate empire's unchecked power, decided to step in, and in 1773, the Regulating Act was passed, marking the first time the British government took direct control over the company's administration. This is when a British colonial administrator, Warren Hastings, enters the story. As the first Governor-General of India, Hastings was a complex figure, part reformer and part opportunist. He introduced legal and tax reforms, studied Indian languages, and even supported scholars translating ancient Indian texts. But his efforts were still built on a system of exploitation. Hastings tried to bring order to a chaotic empire, but the foundation remained deeply unjust. Under his rule, a strange dual system of governance emerged. Indian princes remained in place, but their power was largely symbolic. The real decisions were made by British officials, operating in the shadows or outright controlling courtrooms and tax offices. It was colonialism disguised as cooperation, and if cooperation failed, there were always the company's armies. Throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the company expanded aggressively, using war, diplomacy, and policy to absorb more territory. And one clever strategy was the subsidiary alliance. Indian rulers were forced to host British troops in exchange for protection. But those troops had to be paid for, of course, and the cost bankrupted many kingdoms. Worse, these rulers weren't allowed to form treaties with anyone else without company permission. Then came the doctrine of lapse. If a ruler died without a male heir, the company claimed their land, no matter the traditions of inheritance in that region. It was a legal pretext to swallow whole kingdoms. By the 1850s, the East India Company controlled vast swathes of India. Some regions were ruled directly, others through puppet rulers. But the outcome was the same: the flow of Indian wealth into British hands. But beneath the surface, resentment was growing, and in 1857, it exploded, and the spark was a new rifle cartridge. British officers introduced a weapon that required soldiers to bite open greased paper cartridges, allegedly coated in pig and cow fat. To Muslim soldiers, pigs were unclean, and to Hindus, cows were sacred. The order to bite these cartridges wasn't just thoughtless, it was an insult to faith. One Sepoy, Mughal Empire, refused. He attacked his officers and was executed. But the fire he lit could not be contained. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the First War of Independence, spread rapidly. Sepoys turned on their commanders. Cities like Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow rose up. The rebels didn't just want justice, they wanted freedom. Consequently, for 18 months, India was consumed by war. Thousands of British soldiers and civilians were killed, but the Indian losses were staggering, with estimates reaching into the hundreds of thousands. Many died in battle, many more in the famines and reprisals that followed. Then, on the 8th of July 1859, the rebellion was brutally crushed and ended. In the aftermath, the British government made a historic decision. They dissolved the East India Company because it was no longer fit to rule. Subsequently, in 1858, the Government of India Act transferred control of India directly to the Crown. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. A new era began, the British Raj. The company, once a group of merchants with dreams of spice and silk, had transformed into a monster, one that ruled, exploited, and reshaped a subcontinent. But it left a legacy soaked in contradictions. On one hand, it brought railways, modern law, and education. On the other, famine, oppression, and division. And in its wake, it planted the seeds of resistance, of independence, of the long, hard road that would one day lead India to freedom. Because history doesn't forget. It remembers the men like Clive and Hastings, but it also remembers the millions who endured, rebelled, and kept their cultures alive under the shadow of foreign rule. But the story of how it took India and how India fought back is still being written in memory, in legacy, and in the hearts of those who carry history forward. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the East India Company? We learn that power doesn't always come from kings or crowns. Sometimes it comes from ledgers, uniforms without flags, and ambition without limits. The company conquered not just with muskets, but with contracts. Not just with armies, but with alliances and betrayals. It was profit dressed up as policy and commerce that became conquest. And the cost? Measured not just in silver and spices, but in lives, cultures, and generations of struggle. Remember, history is not just about events, it's about the forces behind them. Ambition, greed, fear, pride. It's about people, flawed and formidable, who shaped the world we live in today. The British Empire didn't just take shape in parliament chambers. It was forged in battles like Plassey, in cities like Calcutta and Delhi, and in the quiet suffering of millions. But this is just one chapter in the story of the British Empire. In Episode 3, we turn west to the forests, colonies, and revolutions of North America to see how a patchwork of British settlements grew into a new empire and then rose to rebellion. But before you go, what do you think allowed a company to rule a continent? Was it strategy, opportunism, or something darker? Let us know your thoughts in the comments and tell us what historical puzzles you want us to uncover next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep questioning history. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's what we remember that shapes who we become.